Now welcome to the stage, founder of GDelt Project and Google Cloud GDE, Kalev Litaru.
Thank you so much for having me here today. At its core, my work is really about how we can use machines to understand the world around us. To look across the rich tapestry of global information each day, telling the diverse stories of our shared planet. And transform it into visualizations of global society, what it means to be human, and the stories that drive our shared lives. This in turn led to this question: what if we could map planet Earth in real time? What if we could use machines to just scoop up everything being said across the world each day, across countries, geographies, across everything, and bring that into a single sort of model of our planet, and in turn visualize that to map the global conversation? A vision which today spans more than 400 languages. This is an older map, by the way. One of the most powerful ways in which AI is making this vision possible lies in the world of television news. The Internet Archive's TV News Archive spans 300 channels from 50 countries on 5 continents in more than 150 languages, spanning the past quarter century. But for more than 2 decades, much of that material just sat as files on disk, because we didn't have any ability for journalists and scholars to be able to understand that material. No journalist who wants to study a particular country is going to be able to pore through decades of television. But at that point in time, for much of this time, the speech recognition, the OCR, all these different tools, they just weren't good enough. And in fact, even today, there's only a handful of OCR tools, like Cloud Vision, that are good enough to deal with the unique oddities of television news. Since the dawn of the invasion of Ukraine, we've been using speech recognition, specifically Google's STT tool, and machine translation, Google Translate, to live transcribe and translate coverage from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia for journalists and scholars that are trying to understand that conflict. Then something remarkable happened: large speech models. From being able to transcribe merely a few mere dozen languages, suddenly we could transcribe hundreds of languages. But most importantly, something interesting happened with large speech models that was not expected, and that's the ability to handle code switching. So much of the world is a multilingual society. News broadcasts in many languages. A speaker on television may freely alternate between 3, sometimes even 4 languages in rapid succession. Here we're actually seeing a still from CCTV. You're seeing English, Mandarin, and Arabic, all in just 60 seconds. And this is Chirp. This is Google's speech recognition model. Fully followed that and just code switched as it could be. Now, we recently completed transcription of the Television News Archive's complete uncaptioned holdings, more than 3 million hours, totaling 14 billion words, transcribed completely through Chirp. But of course, it's the visual dimension that makes television different than, say, radio. Let's start with text. Obviously, there's a lot of text on television news, although not everywhere. In some parts of the world, it's sort of text with a little bit of television. In some parts of the world, there's actually very little text on screen. But we're very interested in text, because text actually, so 2 different channels can be showing the same live footage, but it's that text in the bottom where they editorialize, they summarize, they distill for their own distinct audiences. So we OCR'd it all through Cloud Vision. 19 billion seconds, totaling 6 quadrillion pixels, yielding 294 billion words in 1.8 petabytes of JSON annotations. And that last number right there is actually quite interesting. When you go into like an OCR project, for example, you don't typically end up with petabytes of annotations. And this in turn, well, oftentimes we think about the technical aspects of these projects, but this was actually quite interesting to us, because one of the challenges was when we start talking with academic scholars of how might you use this data in your work. Well, no one's really OCR'd television news at this scale. Traditionally, OCR is used for things like books or paper, documents, imagery, where we kind of understand page number, et cetera. But how might you, like what file format would you even use to try to especially understand this alongside the spoken word of that moment? So it's a reminder oftentimes that it's not necessarily the technical parts of projects that can be complex, but the methodological, the sort of the scholarly pieces of it. Although again, as you reach upwards in scale, and there were some really unique pieces that we did to this that brought the cost down from $47 million down to about $47,000. And that was a huge shift. That actually is what made this project possible, with some very, very creative uses, leveraging some of the very unique capabilities of Cloud Vision. And that's also a reminder that today, generative AI, Gemini, all these tools, that's sort of what we talk about first is things like Gemini. But to remember that oftentimes for a lot of tasks, especially where hallucination and these things play a role, Google's AI portfolio spans a huge number of tools. And there's far more than sort of transformer-based systems. But then this got us asking this interesting question. What if we could reimagine all these tools to start asking impossible questions? So some journalists came along and they said, well, Tucker Carlson, we know he's on Russian television a lot, but how much is he on Russian television? So we used a facial embedding tool, and we said track how many seconds per day that he shows up in there. And we made a nice little timeline, and that was great. But then we started saying, well, that's not the question that's interesting. The question that's interesting is, who's telling the stories on Russian television? So we said, well, what if we take an episode? There's a show called 60 Minutes. It's an important show. It's not the US, it's a different show. Olga there in the center, she's kind of she's the core host of that. And we said, well, what if we extracted every human face in that episode and looked at who appears on screen alongside of whom and made a co-occurrence graph of that? And it turns out that it's actually a really interesting graph right there. But then we said, well, what if we scale this up to an entire year? So we took an entire year of this episode, 50,000 hours to only 250,000 human faces, and we made that network diagram right there. And at first glance, you might say, well, what's interesting about that? What's interesting is this show has a host, Olga. She also has a couple of co-hosts. And there were some interesting conversations about, well, in a case like that, like who kind of drives that show? Do you have hosts kind of handing off? Do certain guests talk with certain hosts, et cetera? And what you're able to see there is the world revolves around one person. The others are kind of periphery. And the ability to see these types of things at this scale is really fundamental as we start asking these questions about how do we tell stories. But then we started to ask, well, what does television news depict? When you turn on the TV, what are the visual narratives? If we're talking about inflation, do I see food? Do I see electricity? What are the actual visual narratives we see? So much like Hitchhiker's Guide in the Galaxy, we asked, well, during COVID, what is COVID news? How is COVID news different? And the answer was bookcases. Because again, think about during COVID, at least here in the US, most people were presenting from home. And here in the US, one of the short forms, if you want to appear scholarly and learned on television, what do? You find the only collection of books in your house and you aim the camera so you have books behind you. But what's interesting is not on every channel. And that was actually quite interesting to us. Why did MSNBC have so many guests posing in front of bookcases, but CNN didn't? These are fascinating questions. But classical computer vision tools can only recognize about 30,000 objects and activities at this point in time, which was enough to answer fundamental questions like, what is the density of military imagery on Russian television? But still, we were hugely limited. So then came along multimodal embeddings. So instead of a set of predefined categories, suddenly you could just type up in plain English what you wanted to find. Very powerful. But why have a human being sit there and have to come? That still means that a human being has to think about what might be interesting to search for and then type that up. Why not just have a machine sit there and watch television, describe frame by frame what it's seeing? We actually had a golden retriever detector for a while. It was a cute little toy, and it actually demonstrated, though, how often cute dogs are actually on television. But, again, powerful. But that's still one frame. That's still a machine watching a frame at a time, and, it's kind of it's interesting. So we said, well, let's have it watch an entire day of Russian television. So we handed a day of Russian television. We just had it sit there and just watch it day by day and summarize. You get these long textual descriptions here. And it's interesting. But at the same time, I've gone from this much text to this much text. And the ultimate question when we talk about, everyone talks about summarization, et cetera. Well, why are you summarizing it? What are you trying to accomplish here? And one of the things that came up is during disaster scenarios, we need to be able to rapidly triage everything that's being said. Because again, you've got all this material coming in. Well, what's being announced? If some diplomat gets on screen and announces something, you want to be able to see, well, does that match? Is this some announcement we haven't seen yet? So that's, we want to go from this to something like this, codification. And so we want to be able to say, well, here's everything being said at this moment. This was during the Turkish earthquake. So we want to be able to say, here's everything being said out there. And just collapse that down. Look for just stuff about aid promises, medical promises, et cetera, and then codify that so you can triage that. But at the same time, this is still for a human being to do something with, right? Again, ultimately, I can take this, and now as a human being, I can make decisions. But what we really want is to go a little bit further beneath that. So we want to go from factual reporting to things more like subjective analyses. To be able to ask not just what's being said, but how it's being framed. Is this country strong, weak? Is this good? Is this bad? Is this aligned? Is it not? But again, this is still a machine just summarizing things, doing more analysis. So we're going from rote summarization to more and more analysis. But it's still a human being having to make a decision. So we ask, well, wouldn't it be nice if machines could actually take those actions for us? So we said, well, what about an autonomous diplomacy, an agentic diplomat? So we had an LLM sit there and watch Iranian state television, and we said, you are a diplomat in the US State Department. Your job is to respond to the nuclear accord. Anything that is positive about the nuclear accord, leave it. If it criticizes the nuclear accord, we want you to write a point-by-point rebuttal based on the current US State Department's various responses to that. And just left it alone, just sitting there happily watching television, looking for these mentions, writing different rebuttals, English, Persian, for all kinds of different outlets, et cetera. Now again, none of this was actually published, but it was a test, because at this point in time, there were a lot of people that said, well, that would never work. You couldn't actually ever accomplish something like that. No, it actually was quite effective, and we deployed it across all kinds of different topics. And it turns out it's remarkably effective, and the text is actually interesting. In a number of these cases, we actually compared what the machine was generating with what the US State Department's own human beings were producing. And what was interesting is we actually handed that out to some people without telling them which was which, and they actually thought this was the human, and what the humans were doing was the machine. This is really interesting stuff. Whether this is incredibly exciting or incredibly frightening is in the eye of the beholder, but the fact is, this is where we're at today. And oftentimes when we think about like agentic systems, we talk about, oh, schedule a meeting for me, or, oh, take this email and do this for me. We don't think about these higher order questions. And we even had to generate imagery to go with it. Now again, obviously this is a while ago, but again, the fact that you can have sort of that end-to-end process there. But here's where things get truly incredible. Returning to those maps I showed in the very beginning, we started to ask this question. Now with these multimodal embeddings, we can start to do really interesting things. So we said, let's take a day in the life of one country. So we took, for Iran, we took one domestic television channel, IRINN, and we took one channel that's Iranian that's aimed at the outside world, Press TV. And we took for one day, we took a frame every second, and we ran multimodal embedders and then clustered it. Now at first glance, you see this, and you say, well, it kind of looks like a mess. But actually, if you dive into this, what you see is both channels are telling many of the same stories, but with very different imagery. And there's really fascinating stories behind why the imagery for a domestic audience is different from a foreign audience. There's some fascinating stories in this. But that's one country of one day. What if we scale this up? 3 countries in one day. So we have Iran, China, and Russia here. Now, at first glance, this looks like 3 different countries, different media. But if you dive into it, it turns out they're telling many of the same stories. But the imagery that they're using is so different that at first glance to something like a multimodal embedder, it looks like wildly different stories here. And this is really fascinating, again, the parallel media universes in which we live. But let's scale up again. Instead of 3 countries on one day, let's look at the entire planet. Everything that we monitored across the entire planet yesterday. Every little microscopic dot on there. is an article or a story, and then blending up the stories and meta stories and groupings of stories. Every tendril is an arc of related stories. But let's scale up now, 3 days. This is where things get really interesting. We start to see emergent patterns that define life on Earth. Not our differences and our divides, but our shared stories and similarities. The ability to start seeing the world through others' eyes. Now, from this macro level, we can dive into one tiny little corner of that and look at a day of COVID vaccine stories. Now, this becomes very interesting because during COVID, this allows us to see a lot of misinformation stories. So you'd see, for example, falsehood pop up here and another one pop up there. But what would be interesting is the government now would be reacting to this original story. But what you can see in the data as you see that graph evolving, these temporal graphs, you can start seeing these stories. They're almost like galaxies. They collide and then they separate. They take a little bit from each other, which requires you to then react, to then change how you're trying to counteract to that. And the ability to see that. Now, from a story level, we can drill all the way into the individual entities that are driving that story. So these are actually trillion-edge graphs that we've computed in BigQuery to be able to do this. And this is where things get really interesting because you can start understanding that scaffolding of society. So how these individual entities are reacting in different ways that constitute different stories. And then we can dive in even further. So this is actually global media from across the planet over from 79 to 2010. And this gets actually quite interesting because we talk, oftentimes people say social media was the rise of negativity in society. Actually, it was the rise of the web. And it's actually, there's some fascinating stuff if you go into this, because suddenly with the rise of the web, news outlets across the entire planet were having to compete to each other. This was the rise of clickbait. Negative news sells, but this was the rise when suddenly news outlets really start leaning into that heavily to compete with one another. But then we can zoom back out to a map like this, which is a really powerful map. So this is not how happy or sad people are around the world. This is, if you take everything said yesterday about a given point on Earth, how positive and negative it is. So for example, I have Estonian heritage. And so if you look really carefully up in Estonia there, parts of it are positive, but there's definitely a number of negative points there. And so, the question is, for example, if someone reads and they say, oh, well, it's an ex-Soviet state, if that's what their news is portraying, then they might see Estonia as a very negative place. Versus they say, wow, this is where Skype came from, this, e-residency, digital government, all this amazing stuff. So this map is a reminder that most of us haven't visited every city on Earth. We understand much of the world through what we see online, through the material, the news, the information that we consume. So this map is a very powerful reminder that if you want to understand society, you have to look locally at local media. But then it's really interesting is once you have all this data, this massive live graph of the entire planet, you can start sifting through for very interesting patterns. So in December of 2019, all of a sudden there was this glimmer of a SARS-like viral pneumonia. And that glimmer then began expanding in very interesting ways. This is actually using what used to be called the Timeseries API, an inference API from Google. And that ability to look at planetary-scale patterns, to see the earliest glimmers of tomorrow's biggest stories. But still, this is a graph, and I don't want a graph or something scientific. I want something that's much more personalized. So we came up with this concept of a persona-based news recommender service. So this idea that you would type a description. I'm a supply chain analyst at Ford Motors. I'm trying to understand how all these tariffs and all this stuff is going to impact my business. Now today you would say, well, summarize that. Just take all this news and summarize it. But summarization doesn't help me. I mean, if you tell me, okay, there's 500,000 articles yesterday about these tariffs and their impact on supply chains, and you give me a massive summary of that, that summary just tells me a summarization of what was said, not how it's going to impact my business. So we've been really starting to explore the ways in which these models can actually start reasoning about impact. So read between the lines. Don't tell me what the news said. Read between the lines and tell me its impact on me. An agentic research assistant. Any persona, any topic, any task. Complete with imagery. Now, what you end up with then are richly detailed analyses like these. So these are actually the 4 examples. One of them was actually quite interesting. We said, we talk about summarizing the state of AI today. We tend to focus on academic research papers. But it's really important to understand, what is general society hearing about AI? Are they hearing it's going to kill them, take their jobs, et cetera, or be helpful? So understanding that is really, really important. But of course, we all know context windows are very limited today. So you can fit about 6,000 news headlines in a 1 million token window. That's a problem when you might have 500,000 articles and you want to sift through those to find those macro level patterns. So we're going to be announcing later this summer some really, really interesting work that uses large-scale knowledge graphs and reaching all the way back to some of the early techniques of NLU when scalability was more important, and using it as a scaffolding onto which to layer our modern LLMs. And we're seeing some really, really exciting ways in which this is allowing us to leap out of some of those token limitations. So thank you so much. And by the way, everything you've seen today is open source, open data, and powered by GCP. Thank you so much.